Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Welcome back to the series Brazil, 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. The topic this week is how 38 years of Brazil changed me and how Brazil has changed in 38 years. And invited for this conversation here is Alistair Clark, a recently retired operational research academic and formerly director of research in the Faculty of Environment and Technology at the University of the West of England. And I am Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. Welcome all, and especially welcome Alistair. How are you, Alistair?
Thank you. I'm very well. Thank you very much for inviting me, Marco. It's a pleasure to be with everybody here. And thank you to the Embassy of Brazil and the Barbados Community College for organizing this series of events. I've been watching them on YouTube. They're very impressive.
Yeah, I should say, so this is an initiative. Thanks also for reminding me. It's an initiative of the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Community College. So let me introduce Alistair to you all. So Alistair Clark, he moved from his native UK to live in Brazil in 1985 to be with his wife Esther, whom he met in London in 1982. He spent 10 years in Campinas in the state of São Paulo, speaking almost exclusively Portuguese at home, work, and also socially. In 1990, he obtained a PhD from the University of Campinas that we also call Unicamp, and he became Brazilian citizen in 92. In 96, he returned to the UK to work in academia, while visiting Brazil for up to 3 months every year for family reasons and also research, as well as on a 6-month sabbatical in 2010. He has published extensively with Brazilian authors in international research journals. I think, Alistair, we will also talk about the research later. We will see. So retiring from UK academia last year, he spent 2022 in Brazil, reconnecting with a country that changed him and has itself changed since 1984, the year of his first visits to Brazil, when he was studying Portuguese, which is an absolute prerequisite to live in this wonderfully and challenging country called Brazil. Yes, Alistair. So really welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you here and have this conversation on Brazil. So can you tell us a little bit, how did you end up being from the UK? How did you end up in Brazil? Why? What were the reasons?
Actually, it started in Ghana, Marco. So Marco and I have something in common, that we've both lived in Ghana. Yes, and I lived in Ghana when I was in my early 20s as a maths teacher in the north of Ghana. And because that was under a military dictatorship at the time, I became interested in human rights. So when I returned to the UK, I became an activist in Amnesty International. And then moving to work in London, I became part of Stockwell Amnesty International Group, which adopted some Mexican landless prisoners. And through that, I became interested in Latin America in general. But the interesting thing about Latin America, of course, is that, because of Mexico, and I traveled in Central America and Peru and Bolivia, I learned Spanish, yeah? And Brazil was that kind of other country which had a language called Portuguese. And I didn't really think much about Brazil, except to be very aware, of course, that it was the industrial giant of South America. And then in 1982, after a trip to Bolivia and Peru, at the house of a Chilean friend, I met my Brazilian wife. And then I started becoming interested in Brazil, yeah? And my wife was doing a PhD at London University at the time. And then finishing her PhD, she had to return to Brazil. So that left me with a dilemma, what do I do? And I thought, let me go live, maybe I could, think about living in Brazil. So I actually did 4 trips to Brazil in 2 years, 1984, 1985. I switched from Spanish to Portuguese, which is not trivial. The pronunciation is very different. And I thought, I like Brazil. It's got a very different feel from the rest of Latin America. And I'd always enjoyed meeting Brazilians in London. I find the British quite reserved in some ways. And one of the wonderful things about Brazil is it's very easy to start chatting to people. And that was true with Brazilians in London. And I found it true in Brazil. you can easily start just chatting to somebody in a queue. Whereas I remember when I returned to the UK in 1996, we were in a kind of a rural village for a while because somebody had lent us a house there. And the milk van came out and there was somebody buying some milk. So I started chatting to her. And she said to me after a while, do we know each other? You know, so it was very unusual in one sense for English people to kind of just start spontaneously chatting to somebody in the street in a queue. You almost had to have an excuse, like having children with you or having a dog. Whereas in Brazil, that wasn't the case. And I loved it. I've always loved this social, easy side of Brazil. And I kind of, in spite of many issues, which I'll talk about in a moment, Brazil has always had a certain charm, even a certain magic for me, which it's kind of managed to retain over the 38 years I've known Brazil. And of course, it's got a lot of challenges, but I've always enjoyed living in Brazil. But of course, it presented very different challenges to me when I came to live here.
So I think we can come back to those challenges very soon. Yeah. But for you, like personally, adapting to Brazil, what did it take? What was the most difficult?
There were two issues I had to face. First of all was to learn Portuguese, because there was absolutely no way I could live in Brazil without learning Portuguese. So I put a lot of effort into that. You just can't get away with English, even nowadays, maybe in airports and universities and so on. So that was a big plus for me. And that helped me integrate socially. I never assumed that anybody was going to speak English. I always made an effort to learn Portuguese and speak it with Brazilians. And at that time, Brazil was much less globalized. There were fewer foreigners in Brazil. Brazilians traveled much less overseas. That's very different nowadays. So I think people were pleased that I was trying to speak Portuguese. Then, of course, I came to live with my wife. So through her, I had a kind of ready-made set of friends, which helped me enormously. But professionally, I had to kind of find my way. So I was a lecturer at Kingston Polytechnic in London at the time, only with a master's. And one of Esther's friends, who himself was doing a PhD in the UK, said, why don't you do a PhD in Brazil? And I thought, oh, I'd never thought of that. That's an interesting. And luckily, Esther's university, the University of Campinas, Unicampi, it's a very good public research university. So I ended up doing a PhD for 4 years at the University of Campinas in my area, which is mathematical optimization. And then after that, I worked for 2 years for IBM at the Latin American Institute of Technology, which was a unit at IBM which did a liaison between universities, clients, and company and their own workforce. And then I worked in consultancy and got to know a tremendous amount about the Brazilian industry for the last couple of years. I was in Brazil. So I found it, yeah.
That's so right, go ahead.
Yeah, so I found that was how I kind of integrated in Brazil. But those two jobs I've just mentioned, even the one with IBM, I got through personal contacts. And that was very different from the UK, where all the jobs I got have been through institutional advertised channels. In Brazil, I think this is still open, this is still true to some extent. Contacts are extremely important. If you want to get a decent job, you have to network like mad. So I learned to network in Brazil much more than I would need to in the UK. And to be honest,
it's actually part of our culture, and also I think Barbadians that are joining us here tonight, they know very well that here it's pretty much the same as in Brazil. So socially networking is very important. Yes. Let me just interrupt you a little bit. Perhaps you saw I'm here showing now a screen, and I'm showing where Alistair is joining us from right now. So he is, as you see in the map, he's in Araraquara, that red dot in the state of São Paulo. That's where he's joining us live. And also, I would like to say to everyone, if you have any question, you can just raise your hand and you can ask the question while we are having this conversation. So yeah, I will stop sharing my screen now again. I just want to show that. But Alistair, you said you faced many challenges when moving to Brazil. Can you talk us a little bit about that?
Okay, so there were two challenges I identified.
Sorry, did I interrupt you for something that you wanted to finish before? No, okay. Yeah, okay.
So going back to 1984 into 1995, after 4 visits and learning the language, I went to Brazil. Yes, and I went straight into the classroom in Portuguese, postgraduate level, and I loved the whole experience. It was a time of my life when I was wanting to get back into research. I had excellent teachers, supervisor, and friends. So that was a very important experience for me. But besides that, there were two other things happening. And I thought about these before I left the UK. First of all, it was an era of very high inflation in Brazil. And I don't know if you've ever lived in a high inflation economy. I had in Ghana in the mid-1970s when it was 100% inflation a year. That's nothing compared to the inflation that Brazil suffered in the mid-1980s. So in the latter part of the 1980s, I had to get accustomed to a very different economic existence. And I'm sure some of the older people from the embassy from Brazil will know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about Cruzeiro, Cruzeiro Novo, Cruzado. Those were three currencies introduced in quick succession, 3 zeros locked off from the former currency. At one time, we were dealing with 3 different denominations, and you had to know which one was which in order to be able to pay things in the shops. And it was a time when it was scary, ironically, if you were middle class and you had an income, then you could put it into something called the overnight. I'd never heard of the overnight before, but that English phrase is what was used in Brazil, where you would put your money in a high-bearing interest account and only take out what was absolutely necessary to put into your current account to actually spend. So
and you would actually get interest rates overnight. So every day you
get interest rates overnight.
On it.
The rate, interest would be credited. Now that's a very scary experience for somebody coming from a more stable economy. But actually, it's not so scary when you get used to it. You just need to know how to deal with it. You go out and spend your salary as soon as you get it. If you can, you try and spend a bit beforehand, because when salaries are paid, then the prices in the shop go up. And in the mid-1980s, things did get scary. You've got 10% inflation a month, then it goes to 20% a month, then it goes to 50% a month. And then even the government gets scared, and there was a new plan coming in to try and freeze prices. And that went on for about 6 or 7 years. And then eventually in 1994, under the Itamar government, a future president of Brazil called Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was then finance minister, came up with a plan of real, and there was confidence behind that plan, so it worked. And Brazil has had the real as its currency ever since, and prices have been stable. But that was a very economically tempestuous and scary time to live in. The other thing which really worried me was the high crime rate. Yes, Brazil was notorious for crime. I actually got attacked or mugged by a group of street kids in Rio on my very first visit. Luckily, I regard that as basically an experience. Yes, I wasn't hurt. I followed the guidebook. I gave my money. They took my money out of the wallet and gave it back. But my Brazilian friends from London who just returned were absolutely overwhelmed by this reminder of what daily life could be like in Brazil. And I think Rio is particularly problematic. But I just learned very quickly to deal with that, and made certain rules, about where you park the car. Don't leave stuff in the car. Have a cheap car. All those type of things which you would do to psychologically overcome that fear of crime. And then gradually you overcome it. So that when I was working for IBM a couple of years later and had to go back to Rio on business, Rio was fine. I walked around, my body language said, I'm talking Portuguese, I'm comfortable here, and I had no problems. Whereas if you're a foreigner in a new place, people can sense maybe your vulnerability. So that kind of fear of crime was quite prevalent during the 1980s and 1990s, because Brazil was in an economic crisis. When the commodity boom came and Brazil's standard of living began to increase, of course, the crime rate went down. And now I think it's gradually increasing again as Brazilians have seen an economic crisis over the last couple of years. But I've learned how to deal with that. So there are kind of these psychological things about how you deal with moving to a new country.
And I guess you quickly also learn, like we do Brazilians, that there are certain areas that you have to avoid at all costs, and even on these days, right? You don't get lost in a shanty town, for example, because that is serious trouble. So I can imagine this is a big challenge. Yes, you wanted to continue, sorry.
Yeah.
Again.
I
keep interrupting you. Yeah.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'd rather you did that. And then the third thing, actually, this is really interesting. If you've ever lived in London, you know there's no point having a car. So I actually lived in London for 7 years, having a bicycle rather than a car, using the London Underground. And then I came to Brazil and I said, there's no way I can come to Brazil and not drive. So actually, I got my UK driving license a couple of months before I actually came to Brazil definitively. And I had to invest in that. So that's kind of a curiosity, as I learned to drive because I was coming to Brazil. And then the other thing was I took my driving license to what's called a despachante, which is a kind of well-known Brazilian figure who acts as an intermediary between you and the bureaucracy. And I said, look, I've got a UK driving license. Can you transfer it into a Brazilian driving license? And he said, yes, and there'll be a translation fee and this other fee and so on. So I kind of paid this money. And then when he gave me back the driving license from Brazil with the translation was absolutely crap, yes. And I've always wondered whether the fee was a hidden bribe. And this is another aspect of Brazil, I think, is that, of course, there's corruption like in most countries, but a lot of it is quite hidden in various types of bizarre payments or consultancy fees. And you're never quite sure whether you've been part of the money you've handed over has gone to kind of grease someone's palm. So corruption in Brazil definitely exists, but it's quite hidden in a way. And you learn about it, obviously, through TV reports, the newspapers and so on. But it's not something which kind of hits you in the face immediately, yes? And that was a kind of another aspect of Brazil to get used to. But I think the other thing was I just growing up at the time? I was living in a new country. I was just going to another culture. Was it just cultural adaptation? And I've never kind of resented that. I've just, I've always considered it as just being an adaptation to another country. And so long as I'm kind of respectful and not hurting people, sometimes you just have to fit into a new reality. And that reality has been quite good for me. I mean, I've always had a very comfortable existence here. And I will say this because there were so few foreigners in Brazil in the 1980s, coming from a high prestige country like England. I know I was afforded opportunities which wouldn't have been given to other Brazilians, and certainly not to Black Brazilians. So not just being white, but also being British certainly made people listen to me more, maybe invite me more than would have been the case if I'd been an ordinary Brazilian, because Brazil is a very unequal country. And although there's a lot of awareness about racism and so on, in practice, it's still extremely challenging.
Yes, that's true. And also another aspect that we mentioned here in the series earlier as well is, in general, foreigners are seen as exotic in Brazil, and therefore they are not seen as a threat, but people usually welcome foreigners. At least that's the impression I had. So there is this aspect as well, especially I imagine in those days, because I imagine, I know like in my village where I grew up, when somebody from Germany would come and visit, those people were seen as exotic and different, somebody to be admired and followed and so on.
Yeah. In fact, I used to joke that Brazilians had an inferiority complex while the British had a superiority complex, And
we even have a word for that, the complexity vira-lata, right? So vira-lata is like a stray dog and has no defined race. So Alistair, what is also interesting is that you mentioned the time you went to Brazil was 1984, 1985. And that is also, in terms of history and politics and what happens in the country, is a very interesting and turbulent moment, because we also had this in this series where we discussed the dictatorship that started in 1964 in Brazil and was crumbling and in 1984 and finally in 1985, democracy is reinstated in Brazil, and the and the dictatorship is finally gone. So how did you see something related to that? Did you experience something of that period? How was that for you?
So it was the tail end of the military dictatorship when I came in 1984. So the military had already agreed to have a gradual handover to civilian rule, yes? And it's what they called an abertura, an opening in Portuguese. And the way the military wanted to try and control it was to have an electoral college, yes, which would choose the next president, yeah? And there was basically two strong candidates in that electoral college. There was the former governor of São Paulo, Paulo Maluf, a civilian politician from the right, very heavily identified with the military. And then there was Tancredo Neves, who was a politician from Minas Gerais. He was from the center, and he was basically the presidential candidate of the democratic opposition. But the military tried to control it by getting the Congress to kind of choose. And so the Brazilians went on this huge demonstration called Direto Já, which was direct elections now. And so actually on my first visit to Brazil, I participated in a massive demonstration in the center of São Paulo with 1 million people, where Lula, in fact, who's the current presidential candidate, and historical politicians like Ulisses Guimarães from the center-right, all came together to press for a democratic opening. And so that was a very exciting and tremendous event to have attended. Interestingly, Tancredo Neves actually died once he became president. And I left Brazil on the same day as he died. And if I'd left a day later, I wouldn't have been able to leave because my airport would have been absolutely crowded out with people, with mourners, with his coffin arriving from São Paulo to São Paulo. So it was a very, you felt the history happening, yes? And I think from that time, there's been a tremendous respect for democratic institutions in Brazil. In spite of certain recent events, you can see that democratic institutions are more or less holding up in Brazil. You know, you have a Congress, which, you know, might be left-wing or right-wing, but they are definitely an independent power from the presidency. And we've seen recently that the Supreme Court has very much tried to ensure that democratic institutions and processes are obeyed. So it's not, you know, like, although Bolsonaro is in power, you know, I think Brazil continues a strong democratic tradition. And of course, we're in the middle of a very exciting, tight race for the runoff for the presidential elections. So, you know, and the media here is full of discussion, yes? It's not like the media is controlled. There's a huge amount of debate. There's a lot happening on social media. So, you know, it's a country which I think since the 1980s has managed to maintain its democratic institutions more strongly. I mean, interestingly about Brazil's military dictatorship, they never really closed the Congress. So you still had a kind of functioning Congress. It wasn't like Argentina or Chile, where you had massive massacres. There was torture, there were disappearances, but it was never quite on the scale of some of the worst dictatorships in Latin America. And that's maybe that's a cultural aspect of Brazil, I think. Brazilians have a culture for reconciliation, even if it means covering up things a lot.
And also to the point that the military sometimes argue that what they had was not a dictatorship because they had a functioning Congress, obviously two parties handpicked MPs, and so. But they said, and the president was elected by the Congress and not by the people. Usually the direct vote as we have in Brazil. Actually, Alistair, talking about that. I don't know if I offer you commiserations for the politics in the UK, you will probably offer me condolences for the way politics are in Brazil, right? So, but how do you see like this confusing political system in Brazil? What do you make out of that?
Of the confusing political system in Brazil?
Yeah, like we have like 32 parties and there is no proper coalition to run the country.
Right.
And
so
a president can never really run the country with his own party. No, he will need the support of several.
No. I mean, in one sense, it's a political system more modeled on the US than it is on the UK. The UK is a parliamentary system, so whoever controls parliament has almost absolute power, Whereas in the US and Brazil, you have a president, but they have to negotiate legislation with a Congress, yes? And the Congress can really exact its price. In the United States, you have Democrats and Republicans. You know, there's quite a strong bipartisan structure. That does not exist in Brazil. Brazil has a much more fluid party situation, and people are often elected on the basis of their personal charisma, their personal standing, a certain amount of clientelism, yeah? And they can join parties, leave parties, parties can come together, regroup. So party discipline in Brazil is much more fluid, yeah? It's just a different system. And that means that the president has to make deals, yes, with people if he wants to get, with people, not necessarily with parties, but with people, if he wants to get legislation passed. And what we've seen a couple of weeks ago is that if Lula is elected, he will still have tremendous challenges dealing with a conservative bloc in the Brazilian Congress, because he will have to negotiate with that bloc in order to get his legislation passed. So even, just bear that in mind, if Lula is elected president of Brazil in a couple of weeks' time, he will still have tremendous challenges in implementing his program. That's the nature of Brazilian politics. A lot of conversation, a lot of negotiation, not a lot of, very little violence, but a lot of hidden favors, pork barrel funding and things like that. But we've seen that to some extent in the United States. And that is not, that's an objective comment about Brazil. It's not a critical comment.
Yeah, and actually, I think everyone that understands a little bit about the political system in Brazil realizes that a president cannot really be a president without handing out favors to some Congress members, being there in terms of giving them ministries to have the power of executive power somehow, or like when we had in the past, in previous governments, what they called the salon, which was like monthly allowances from money from private companies for the MPs to vote in favor of the government, or as we have it now, what they call the secret budget, where MPs dispose of money and they can use it in their own electoral districts, and then in turn get the votes to get elected next time again. So yeah, it's a very complicated system.
But let me qualify that by saying things like that happen in the UK as well. You know, we've had so-called levelling up funds in the UK, which Boris Johnson distributed. They were meant to go to poorer areas. Guess what? They went to the not so poor areas where his electoral support was important. So those kind of things are universal, I think, and just you need strong democratic movements to push back against that.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, Alistair, now, we also know that you said you did some research in Brazil. Did you also do some research that was typically, it only happened because it was typically Brazilian, or?
The research, no, the research was international.
Could only be done in Brazil?
No, it could be done in the UK, it could be done in the US. So I'm a mathematician, yes. My area is called operational research, which is applied mathematics for planning, scheduling, rostering, supply chains, manufacturing, and simulation. So when I arrived in Brazil, I kind of had to look around for a PhD topic, and my supervisor and I identified manufacturing production planning as a new area, which was interesting. And Brazil has a large industrial base, so it was a kind of a topic which was relevant to the country. Now, we did international level research, so my PhD was mainly theoretical, and it was, you know, calling on international papers. And although my thesis was published in Portuguese, the resulting papers were published in English, and that's what happens nowadays. And then as a result of that, I did get a job with IBM. It wasn't so much in applying my thesis, but because I knew something about manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and computer integrated manufacturing, I got this very interesting 2-year job with IBM to basically liaise with universities around Brazil and organize willing lecturers to give courses on specialist subjects to IBM employees in the technical area, to IBM clients, and to kind of basically cultivate the market. So in the course of that, I got to visit the Brazilian steel industry in the state of Minas Gerais. I got to visit the Brazilian poultry industry in the state of Paraná, and Brazil is a huge producer of poultry with very diverse export markets. So when I left IBM and went to work for a small consultancy company which specialized in mathematical modeling, I also was able to go to some of these companies and make bids for mathematical-based software, which would help them become more efficient. And in the course of that, I basically got to know quite a lot about Brazil, traveling around, looking at Brazilian industry, Brazilian mining, the steel sector, the agricultural sector. And I even managed to go up to the Amazon, where, incredibly enough, there is a manufacturing sector in the city of Manaus, very subsidized by taxes, but nevertheless, there's a manufacturing sector there. So I had a theoretical PhD, but it opened up doors to find out a lot about real problems in industry. You know, and Brazil has a lot of manufacturing industry. And that has been an inspiration for a lot of my research ever since, because I came across some really interesting problems, which to solve them, you have to come up with some quite sophisticated mathematical problem and algorithms in order to solve. And of course, I started cooperating with Brazilian academics once I was back in the UK. I've always, you know, had a great time researching with the best Brazilian public universities. And I've had a publishing career in good journals internationally in co-authorship with Brazilians. So that's why I would come back often. I spent a sabbatical here and so on. And it's been a very fruitful area of collaboration. In fact, even today, I was participating online in a workshop organized by the state universities in Sao Paulo on exactly this type of topic. And it was great to see the work which is happening. I think the challenge for universities in Brazil is that culturally there's a divide between universities and companies. And companies traditionally are quite skeptical about universities. You're too theoretical, you're left-wing, you're liberal. And so you often need visionary, charismatic individuals to kind of make that link and to persuade industry that actually universities have a lot to offer. And the good industrialists do that. So there is a kind of a ground for collaboration, but it takes a lot of work and it requires new skills from academics like project management and so on, which traditionally we don't have.
Yes, and also an interesting aspect that I would like to mention. You're obviously coming from the UK, you speak English. Is it possible to be in academia in Brazil and not speak Portuguese?
The short answer is no. You have to publish in English. You can even publish your PhD in English now and have your thesis defense viva in English. But if you're going to have any type of professional and social life, it's essential to talk Portuguese.
Yes, as you said, so it's even in academia, it's not just in, let's say, general life, as you mentioned at the beginning, right?
If you got a job in a Brazilian university only speaking English, you will have a very restricted social life amongst fellow academics. You'll struggle to do anything like buying a car, going shopping, traveling. The only people who really speak English in Brazil, I'd say with good level, are in airports, big companies, universities, and outside there, you know, maybe some young people from middle-class families. Outside there, the level of English is very poor. And think about it, why is that? If I'm in the UK and I want to learn Spanish, I can go on a plane for 2 hours to Spain. If the Spanish person wants to learn English, they can easily go to the UK. But if you're in Brazil, it's a 9-hour flight to Miami. Maybe even to Barbados, you'd have to go through Miami. I was looking at the connections earlier today.
Or Panama.
Yeah, sort of Panama, yeah, which is, you know, overnight flight, you know. So Brazil is very isolated geographically, and it means that you don't get many native English speakers in Brazil, and it's very difficult to travel to a country where English is an official language. So it's very challenging for Brazilians to learn English. Of course, the internet and Netflix and Amazon Prime and so on have made it a lot easier. So that is changing. But one of the things you really realize about Brazil is it's a long way from anywhere, and it's a massive country. The land mass is larger than the USA, excluding Alaska. You know, it doesn't look like that, of course, because of the Mercator projection. You know, it makes Brazil look like a smaller country.
Yeah, Greenland is actually 6 times smaller than Brazil, but it looks as big or even bigger than Brazil in the Mercator. So I would like to come to a topic that you already partially mentioned. So in doing your work with IBM and also your research, you came around in Brazil. So can you tell us something like, did you have interesting experiences, places that you don't forget for some reason, because they were so nice or so terrible? Tell us a little bit about this experience of getting around in Brazil and seeing places. Is it all similar? Is it diverse? How is that?
It's quite diverse. So let me start with Manaus, which is probably nearer to Barbados. Yes, this is a big city of 2 or 3 million people in the middle of the Amazon. So I went there earlier this year, but I had to fly in. You can't drive in, except from Venezuela. You either sail in or you fly in. And yet it's a massive city in the middle of this vast jungle. And if you're not careful, you could sort of wander on the outskirts and get lost. You know, it happened to a friend of mine. He got lost on the edge in the forest, you know, and you could easily become disoriented. So that's a very bizarre city. I think Manaus is there because of the rubber boom at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, it wasn't 2 or 3 million people then, and it exists on huge subsidies, but it's a fascinating city.
And you got the surreal opera house there as well, right?
That's right. Yeah. Which is very nice. You know, there's a little sort of tourist zone around there. But the other thing I really did, and this really struck me from my trip, was that having flown in, I decided I was going to sail down the Amazon from Manaus to the next state, Pará, to a place called Santarém, from where there is a road down to São Paulo. And so if you go to the waterfront in Manaus, instead of a big busy bus station, you've got a busy water station with all types of Fitzcarraldo type boats and some really big, serious river ferries. So I actually paid for a cabin in a river ferry, which was taking about 4 lorries downstream for 30 hours to Cuiabá, to Santarém. And that some of them were actual lorries who wanted to go by road from Manaus to São Paulo. So the 30-hour river ferry was part of their trajectory. So I ended up talking to lorry drivers, to people, you know, on the boat. You gradually, you know, during a 30-hour journey, you start talking to people. And one of the things I kind of remember from this conversation is chatting with a guy, enjoying the sunset, and he had a Bolsonaro T-shirt on him. So I started, you know, since we started off friendly enough, we had a conversation about why he liked Bolsonaro and why I wouldn't vote for him and things like that. And it was interesting because contrary to kind of like the image you get in the press here, where there's been some violent incidents recently between supporters of different parties, I was able to have a cordial conversation with this person, yes? And that's, I think, one of the things which, if you're careful in Brazil, you can end up being friends with people who think very politically different from you. So I've had friends in Campinas who, simply because I was white, middle class and professional, automatically assumed I would be a centre-right voter. And when I told them, no, I'm centre-left rather than centre-right, they were almost shocked, as if I was like a class traitor. And yet these are lovely people. I'm going to remain friends with them. Whereas actually in the UK, I have very few conservative friends, maybe because the gap feels too great. But in Brazil, it doesn't feel too big, even though I know many of them voted for a different person than I would vote for. So I find those kind of cultural things interesting in Brazil. Maybe it's partly because I'm a foreigner. I'm kind of like a curiosity. When I open my mouth, people obviously know I'm a foreigner, so I get some leeway. But I found I've managed to have kind of conversations with people who think very differently from me in Brazil than I've had in the UK. And maybe that's partly the product of what's called, Mark, you know your literature. Who was it who talked about the cordiality of the Brazilian? Was it Machado de Assis?
Oh, no, the cordiality of the Brazilians was a guy called Florestan Fernandez Jr., if I'm not wrong. It was
Maybe.
sociology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've always remembered this phrase because I think it's a valuable insight into Brazilian character. Anyway, so yeah, homem cordial, yeah. It's true, although it hides a level of inequality, which is very sad. The other thing I've been to, of course, is Sao Paulo, which is a massive city. It's 20 million. I used to go there a lot. I don't like to go there nowadays. It's just too big and noisy for me. But I can get around Brazil, with Uber, with buses and so on. I do use public transport a lot here. I don't actually drive a lot here, but I do occasionally hire a car and go off, say, to Goiás and Brasilia and have a look around there. And I will probably do the same in a couple of weeks' time to São José dos Campos, which is between here and Rio. So I do drive on Brazilian highways quite a lot. The roads are pretty good. You end up meeting people. It's a very varied country. The landscape can go from mountainous to dry, to tropical coastal forest, to long stretches. It's a very varied country, but it's all definitely Brazil. So that when you meet Brazilians overseas, there is this kind of cultural identity which you immediately feel you have something in common with them, which is very different from something you might have in common with other Latin Americans who speak Spanish. There's the Hispanic-Portuguese divide, I think, is quite big in Brazil, except maybe where you come from, Marco, down in the south of Brazil, where you're near Uruguay. It's
true, yeah. Because, and also you were mentioning that before, because of the dimensions of the country. So if you are, let's say, somewhere in Minas Gerais, there is no neighboring country in sight in the next 3,000 kilometers, right?
Yeah. I mean, Brazil has basically got forests around its borders, from French Guiana all the way around to basically Bolivia. And in Bolivia, you can start going across the land border.
And that's why we also have this myth of believing, a lot of people believe firmly that all our neighbors speak Spanish because we have no access to French Guiana or Guyana, English-speaking Guyana or Dutch-speaking Suriname, right? So it's really like the forest works as a big fence to separate us from those countries in the north. And so far so that those countries in the north that I just mentioned, they are sometimes considered Caribbean and not in America or South America. Yeah, so we have not so much time left. I would like to see if people have questions, but you also said you noted down a few things. Is there something that you would like to talk about? And you also you sent me some pictures. If you want to show some of those pictures, we can do that as well. So, but first, what did you choose to talk about, and I did not allow you to talk about it so far?
No, I think I've covered most of the things. It's just to say that there's a phrase, isn't there? Eu tenho orgulho de ser brasileiro. Yes, I'm proud to be Brazilian, and I feel that. Yes, I mean I have dual nationality. If you go on my YouTube channel, I have both the Brazilian and the British flags. So it's a country which is very dear to my heart. Yeah. And it's a country which in the last couple of decades, I think has become more prominent on the world scene, with the BRICS and things like that. I think it's a country which deserves a lot more attention, yes. It is certainly covered more in the foreign press nowadays than when I was first coming here 30 years ago. If you look at The Guardian, it has a lot, a British newspaper, it has a lot of Brazilian coverage. If you look at The Economist, they have an office in Sao Paulo. So I think Brazil is gradually getting the recognition its size and importance merits, yes, in the international press. And people know a lot more about it than maybe 30 years ago. So, I mean, I just see that as, as part of what I'm interested in, is just telling people a bit more about Brazil and getting away from the cliches, yeah? And it's a country, which has, I think, a strong democratic instinct. It has huge challenges, which I won't go into. But certain things are developing here. There's something called the SUS, which is Brazil's National Health Service. That's gradually developing. It would be nice if it was a truly national health service. I think the law here more or less functions. There's a lot of impunity, and I think the conviction of Lula by Sergio Moro damaged its credibility. But on the whole, the judges are reasonably reliable. So I think institutions are still fairly robust in Brazil. But of course, in the long term, they can eventually be subverted. And I guess that's one of my concerns in the long term about Brazil, just as Orban has done that in Hungary, yeah, and Trump tried to do that in the USA. So I think that's really what I wanted to say.
I will have a question after people ask you, yeah. But I'll already pose a question right now. So yeah. And you already also partially mentioned it again. What do you think, that is an answer for later, Brazil, where is Brazil going from here, right? So you saw Brazil, you experienced Brazil in the last 38 years, and what is your hope for Brazil in the future? But I don't know, do you want to show any of those pictures over there that you sent me?
Oh, well, I don't have them particularly with me.
I have them here, I can show them if you want.
You can show them some of them, yeah. And I can comment on them.
Okay, so I'm not necessarily in the same order here. Let me share.
But maybe I can answer Charlotte Thomas's question while you're looking.
Yeah, Charlotte, you can ask the question right now. Yeah.
Hi, good night. Thank you for presentation. I have two questions for you.
Okay.
What is the biggest change that you've personally seen, not in general, but the biggest change that you've seen in Brazil since you've been there? And two, how, knowing what you know now, how would you make your move to Brazil easier for you? What would you do differently?
Right. I think the biggest change I've seen is just how much more globalized Brazil has become since I came here 35 years ago. That's partly because Brazilians have traveled more, and that's partly because of the internet and the opening up of Brazil to foreign investment in the 1990s. So when Brazil began growing seriously due to the commodities boom about 15 years ago, I was kind of like taken by surprise, because in one sense I thought, oh, Brazil is this kind of permanent basket case. But then suddenly Brazil started growing a lot, plane passengers became browner, to be honest. It wasn't just white plane passengers. People's on low income started going into the lower middle class. And that's now been reversed to some extent because of the recent recession. But with technological change and with a lot more travel, and Brazilians traveling abroad, I just think Brazil has become a lot more globalized. And so nowadays, I'm just another foreigner in Brazil. People are curious about me, but I don't feel that type of old, how should we say, deference that I used to have when I was here, first of all, in the 1980s. And I think that's a good thing. Brazil shouldn't be deferent to any nation. Would I do it again? I probably would. I think studying is a very good way of integrating into Brazil, and I was fortunate that I had a master's in a STEM subject, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There was a very good university where I was. They took me on board after I showed that I was serious and not just a kind of a visa scam, and that helped me integrate into Brazil. So I think if you can study here, then I think that's a good way of coming to Brazil. Just a word, Brazilian public universities are free, and I think they continue to be free for foreigners. But in terms of grants to actually live, I don't know how that works. But if you're willing to learn Portuguese, then I think you can find some study and research and job opportunities in Brazilian universities. Does that answer your question, Charlotte?
Thank you very much for your answer.
Was that what you were expecting?
Actually, the Brazilian embassy offers scholarships for people to study in Brazil, and even the post-graduation, those scholarships they get also monthly allowance.
Yeah, go for it. I would if I were you. It's one of the easiest ways to integrate into Brazil.
Okay, so we have the pictures here, and meanwhile, if somebody else can have a question. Sorry, you can raise your hands. Okay. So do you want to comment on those pictures?
Okay, so this is a picture of me and my wife Esther. It's actually just outside where I am now in Araraquara. It's a kind of lower middle class neighborhood, but it has some nice trees. And that's us in 1988. So that's, wow, over 30 years ago. And that contrasts with both of us nowadays. That photo you can see on the left is us in the UK in our kitchen, you know, and that was taken a few years ago, yeah? So there's probably about 30 years between both photographs. We've aged quite well, I think. Esther's aged particularly well, I think. And that other one is last year in Brussels. If you've been to Brussels, you probably recognize the Place, the Grand Place. And that was when my stepdaughter, Esther's younger daughter, got married in Brussels. She's living there now. And so we went over for a civil wedding, which was in Brussels Town Hall, which is in that place. So that's us last year. Right, this is me, I think, wow, 10 or 15 years ago in the northeast of Brazil. So that coastline you can see is probably Paraíba State, which is just north of Recife, one of the easternmost parts of Brazil. And you can see there's some coastal erosion. There are some beaches, which I'm sure are pretty similar to the ones in Barbados. Brazilian beaches are just phenomenal. Yes, I think they're an undiscovered paradise, which English speakers could do well to come and explore. I think a lot of Italians and people from Latin language countries come to Brazil. But I know from my experience that the British tend to go to the Caribbean. Maybe it's a language issue. Maybe it's, you know, they're just more familiar with the Caribbean. But there are just fantastic beaches in Brazil. There's like 4,000 kilometers of coastline, and they're just great beaches studded all along it. That's a typical beach from the northeast of Brazil. Sao Paulo's a bit more is different, probably a bit more lush. Okay, right. Well, this is this is in Brazil. Do you know where this is, Marco?
It looks like somewhere in the northeast or in the Cerrado.
No, it's actually Ghana. So,
oh, this is Ghana. This is not. Oh no, yeah. I understood you said it is in Brazil because I thought first it is in Ghana.
No, it's not in Brazil. So this is what when I first began to be interested in human rights development issues. Immediately after graduating mathematics in 1975, I went on something called voluntary service overseas, where I went to a school in the far north of Brazil and taught mathematics for 2 years. And so this is me in 1976, when I was like 22 years old.
Yes,
voluntary service overseas was very, but it's interesting because I tell you one thing, living in the north of Ghana in the 1970s was a very challenging experience, much more challenging than Brazil, because it was the first time I'd ever lived totally outside a consumer society. So those clothes I'm wearing, I had either brought from Britain or they were made in the local market. There was no beer. Life was very basic. You can see I'm wearing flip-flops. So that was a very interesting, challenging, but life experience for me during 2 years. And I would recommend that kind of experience when you're young, not necessarily when you're older, and definitely before you get settled into a relationship or a career. Right, the other one is me in 1984, the year of my first visit to Brazil. And we went to visit the region of Minas Gerais in Brazil. So Brazil has lots of wonderful waterfalls, and you can walk up to waterfalls along tracks. And this is a photo taken by my wife Esther of me looking rather too serious beside a waterfall in the state of Minas Gerais. So that's 1984. Right, this one is...
Next one, you don't look too serious in the next
one. This one was earlier this year. This one's really hot. This one is me early this year up in the Amazon. So this is a very interesting place called Alter do Chão, which is in Pará State. It's about halfway along the Amazon up to Manaus. and it's become a tourist destination because it has river beaches which go up and down with the flow of the river according to the seasons of the year. So this is the wet season. It's relatively flooded, and you can see I'm on a boat being taken around a kind of forested area, which is half mangrove and half what's called igarapé. And it was just a tremendous trip. I was in somewhere called the Enchanted Forest, I think, and it totally deserves that name. So that's one of the really good parts of tourism on the Amazon. Right, the other photo is of myself in 1975 or 76. I'm in northern Ghana. I'm drinking millet beer called pito out of a calabash with the fellow teachers, yeah. And in fact, I remember this particular conversation because the guy whom I'm looking to, and who's slightly leaned over, was the deputy headmaster. And he was holding me to account for British imperialism in Africa. I remember this conversation. And I said, of course, I don't defend it, but that's history, you know, and you know, we all have to move on, as well as being conscious of the worst aspects of the slave trade and what the British Empire did to many countries. The experience in Ghana was relatively benign, so I was surprised to hear some Ghanaians call Britain home only 20 years after independence. And I thought that was very weird. So I found that as a young white teacher, I was relatively well accepted. I think Nigeria is a tougher place to be in. Ghana, I don't know what your experience was, Marco, but Ghana was a relatively
I had no issue. It was always welcome.
Yeah. And I would say that Ghana is a relative success story in Africa. You know, it's quite a big developed country, relatively developed mid-income country now, still with huge issues, but it's much safer and secure than Nigeria. Right, this is me in the early 2000s with my granddaughter Anna. So we're watching TV on the sofa. So that's 2003. And this also is me, I think, wow, in the mid 1980s. With a linguistics lecturer from the University of Campinas called Akira Osakawa. That's a Japanese name. Many Japanese came to Brazil about 100 years ago, mainly from Okinawa or peasant backgrounds. And particularly around the Sao Paulo region, they introduced market gardening, and they're very prevalent in Sao Paulo. They have a reputation for being very well educated, for being technically proficient. And Akira is here with me, showing me around San Vicente, which is a port on the coast of Sao Paulo. So he was a very dear person. He was the best man at our wedding, to give you an idea of how close we were to him. Right, this other one I put there as a curiosity. Can anybody guess who this is? Who's the person in the center in a sailor's uniform, waving to the crowd? It's King Charles, or Prince Charles as he was then. So he was on a visit to northern Ghana in 1976 or 77, and you can see a military man next to him. Ghana was a military dictatorship at that time, so that is the military governor of the upper region of Ghana, accompanying Prince Charles. And you can see in the background traditional chiefs with their sunshades being there as a great honor. So we were invited along. It was just a big meeting with paramount chiefs and a big ceremony, and it's just a historical curiosity which I gave to Marco. And I gave that to Marco because we both know Ghana, so it's not really relevant to this.
No, it's interesting, yes. Okay, so we have time for a last question, if there is any. Anyone would like to still ask something? Otherwise, we close the session.
Can I go back to Charlotte Thomas, and
yes.
say, you know, are you thinking of studying in Brazil, Charlotte?
Hi, I can't say that I'm interested in studying right now, but I would definitely like to visit, maybe for an extended period.
Okay. You could see whether you could do an academic visit if you're that way inclined. I don't know if you could make some contact with people in Brazilian universities, and then you wouldn't have to learn Portuguese. You could probably get away in English for a short visit. But if it was a longer visit, you definitely need to invest in Portuguese. It's a very welcoming country, Charlotte, with all the usual caveats about security and so on. I love it. So come and experience it.
Awesome, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Right.
So if there are no other questions, Alistair, I thank you very much for being here with us for this conversation today.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting conversation, and I can feel your passion about Brazil and the way you see Brazil is very interesting as well. So we thank you very much for this conversation, and I hope people that are here with us live and people who will watch it later will learn a few more things about Brazil. They certainly will.
Okay.
Based on your observations. So thank you very much. And
well, thank you for inviting me, Marco, and also thank you for posting the other ones on YouTube. I've been watching some of them. Yes, they're really interesting.
Yes. Okay. So that's it then for today.
Okay.
Next week we come back with another topic. So I invite you all to come back and be here with me as well. So see you all next week, and I say ciao ciao, boa noite.
Boa noite. Ciao.
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 Boa noite.
Boa noite.